Today, we're diving into the fascinating and, honestly, frequently forgotten story of Benjamin Harrison. He's one of those late 19th century presidents we tend to just skip over, blending them into this long blur of facial hair and top hats. But the reality is, Harrison's single 4-year term quietly built the foundations of the modern American state. It was a presidency packed with truly transformative, unprecedented federal action. Now, this first part is going to sound incredibly familiar to modern political observers. Back in 1888, Benjamin Harrison received about 90,000 fewer popular votes than the incumbent, Grover Cleveland. But, he didn't need them. Harrison carried the Electoral College with a really decisive 233 to 168 victory. And the wild part? Without making a single backroom political bargain himself, his supporters managed to secure the exact pledges needed to put him right in the White House. So here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at the front porch underdog. Then, a billion-dollar country. Third, civil rights and global reach. And finally, how the surplus evaporates. All right, part 1, the front porch underdog. Harrison's life is just a classic 19th century American success story. He was born in 1833 on a farm along the Ohio River and eventually made his way to Indianapolis to build his career. He marries Caroline Lavinia Scott in 1853, but like so many others, his life gets completely interrupted by the Civil War. And he didn't just sit it out. He served, rising all the way to the rank of brigadier general. After the war, he had some setbacks, even getting mocked as Kid Gloves Harrison during a failed run for governor, but he bounced right back. By the 1880s, he was representing Indiana in the U.S. Senate. When he was nominated for president in 1888, Harrison ran what became a famous front porch campaign. He was literally delivering speeches right from his own home in Indianapolis. And the partisan attacks that year, very, very personal. Democrats relentlessly mocked his 5'6" stature, calling him Little Ben. But Republicans fired back with a brilliant nod to his grandfather, former President William Henry Harrison, also known as Old Tippecanoe. They insisted Benjamin was absolutely big enough to wear his grandfather's hat. And hey, clearly that messaging worked. Moving on to part 2, a billion-dollar country. Harrison definitely wasn't just a placeholder president. The guy was a pioneer of federal regulation. Under his watch, the Sherman Antitrust Act became law. This was literally the very first federal act attempting to protect commerce against unlawful monopolies. I mean, think about how much we talk about antitrust laws today when it comes to big tech. Well, Harrison's signature laid the direct groundwork for how modern American commerce is regulated. It's a massive deal. And he was definitely not afraid to spend money to build up the nation. For the very first time in American history, outside of a war anyway, Congress appropriated $1 billion. Critics were just absolutely aghast at the price tag. But Speaker Thomas B. Reed delivered this legendary, unapologetic clapback to the press. He just simply said, "This is a billion-dollar country." That $1 billion wasn't just vanishing into thin air either. It was actively poured into vital national scaffolding. Harrison funded substantial internal improvements and backed this massive naval expansion, effectively transforming the U.S. Navy into a modern, formidable force. Plus, by adding federal subsidies for steamship lines, he guaranteed a strong American presence out on the open seas. He was essentially building the physical infrastructure of a future global powerhouse. Now, this leads us to the most perplexing domestic problem of his entire term, the tariff issue. Basically, super high import taxes had created a massive surplus of cash sitting in the Treasury, which critics argued was hoarding money and hurting the economy. So, what was the Republican solution? Somehow an even higher tariff bill. To manage that overflowing treasury, they got creative. They wiped out the import tax on raw sugar to lower prices for consumers. But to stop American sugar growers from going totally bankrupt from cheap foreign imports, the government just paid them a 2-cent per pound bounty directly from the treasury. It was a highly complex, aggressive workaround purposefully designed to drain the surplus. Let's look at part 3, civil rights and global reach. Looking at his domestic policies, we see a president taking some very concrete actions on civil rights during a really dark, deeply challenging era. Harrison actually endorsed bills meant to protect civil rights for African Americans, and he vigorously enforced the 15th Amendment to protect voting rights. On top of that, he made a massively significant diplomatic appointment by choosing the legendary Frederick Douglass to serve as the U.S. minister to Haiti. Harrison actually relied on Douglass's counsel quite frequently. over on the international stage, Harrison was immensely proud of pushing a vigorous foreign policy. In 1889, he gathered allied nations for the very first Pan-American Conference in Washington. And this wasn't just some casual meet and greet. They established a formal information center that eventually became the Pan-American Union. Harrison recognized early on that if the Americas were going to share in economic growth, they needed lasting, formal cooperation. His administration firmly believed that good diplomatic relations went hand in hand with economic reciprocity. So, after locking down reciprocal trade agreements with friendly nations, Harrison started looking aggressively out toward the Pacific. Right at the tail end of his administration, he submitted a treaty to annex Hawaii, a really bold signal of America's brand new global ambition. Though, in a pretty bitter twist of fate, his successor, President Cleveland, withdrew that exact treaty almost immediately after taking office.
Which brings us to Section 4, the surplus evaporates.
So the very financial boom that funded all those ambitious projects, it just vanished. That massive treasury surplus was totally drained by his billion-dollar Congress long before his term was even over. The national prosperity that had been acting as a shield for his administration just dried up alongside those funds, and the political atmosphere in Washington shifted literally overnight. And the political fallout was immediate. During the 1890 midterms, congressional elections went stingingly against the Republicans. Party leaders, seeing the writing on the wall, quickly began distancing themselves from him. They did technically renominate him in 1892, but honestly, the damage was already done. In a total, brutal reversal of what happened 4 years prior, Harrison was defeated by Grover Cleveland. Yep, the exact same man he had ousted to take the presidency in the first place. To make matters worse, this devastating political defeat was compounded by an unimaginable personal tragedy. Just 2 weeks before that 1892 election, First Lady Caroline Harrison died of tuberculosis. It was heartbreaking. For the short remainder of his term, his grieving daughter, Mary, had to step up and serve as the White House hostess. Following his defeat, Harrison went back home to Indianapolis. He eventually married his late wife's niece in 1896 and lived a quiet life in Indiana until passing away in 1901. So, we are left with a really fascinating historical puzzle here. Benjamin Harrison signed the very first federal antitrust laws, massively expanded the Navy, championed voting rights, and spent unprecedented sums to build American infrastructure. Yet he lost the popular vote, watched his treasury surplus vanish, suffered a stinging midterm rebuke, and lost his own re-election bid. It leaves us with such a provocative question. If a leader quietly builds the structural foundation of a billion-dollar country, but ultimately loses the faith of their party and the voters, what is their true legacy? Does history value the quiet builder, or only the political survivor? It's definitely something to think about the next time you hear politicians arguing over a billion-dollar budget today.